The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Bitter Creek, Wyoming like thunder on a clear day, turning heads and silencing the usual afternoon commotion. Matthew Daniels hit the ground with a heavy thud, the copper taste of blood filling his mouth as he clutched his chest. The bullet had struck him square in the ribs, but all he could think about was the terrified woman standing behind him, the stranger whose life he'd just saved with his own. It was 1875, and Matthew had only been passing through this small frontier town, another stop on his endless journey across the Western Territories. At 32, he'd spent more than a decade drifting from one cattle drive to another, one mining camp to the next. He hadn't intended to stay in Bitter Creek longer than it took to resupply, but fate had other plans when he spotted 3 men cornering a woman outside the general store. "You ain't welcome here," one of the men had snarled at her. "Your kind brings nothing but trouble." Matthew hadn't hesitated. Something about the woman's defiant stance, despite her obvious fear, had compelled him forward. "That's enough," he'd said simply, positioning himself between her and the threatening men. He'd hoped his 6'3" frame and the Colt revolver at his hip would be deterrent enough. He'd been wrong. Now, as consciousness began to fade, Matthew felt gentle hands turning him over. Through blurring vision, he saw her face framed by loose strands of honey-brown hair that had escaped from a practical bun, eyes the color of summer sage, and a determined set to her jaw. "Stay with me," she urged, her voice soft yet commanding. "I'm not letting you die for me, cowboy." Those were the last words Matthew heard before darkness claimed him. Tess Armstrong had not anticipated that her first day in Bitter Creek would involve dragging a bleeding man through the dirt. But as the local sheriff seemed more interested in questioning her presence in town than in helping the wounded cowboy, she realized she had no choice. "I need to get him to a doctor," she insisted, pressing her handkerchief against the man's wound. The sheriff, a balding man with a tobacco-stained beard, spat on the ground. "Doc Wilson's gone to Cheyenne, won't be back for a week." His eyes narrowed. "What business you got in Bitter Creek anyway, miss? Ain't seen you before." "I'm opening a school," Tess replied firmly, though her hands trembled as blood soaked through the handkerchief. "Now, are you going to help me with this man, or shall I do it myself?" When the sheriff merely shrugged and walked away, muttering about troublemaking outsiders, Tess knew she was on her own. At 26, she was no stranger to adversity or to the challenges of being a woman alone in the West. After losing her parents to influenza 2 years prior, she'd left Philadelphia to forge her own path, determined to bring education to frontier communities. But nothing had prepared her for this moment, kneeling in the dirt beside a dying stranger who had stepped between her and danger without a second thought. With strength born of desperation, Tess managed to drag the unconscious cowboy to her newly rented cabin at the edge of town. It wasn't far, but by the time she got him inside and onto her bed, her arms ached and her dress was stained with his blood. "Don't you dare die," she whispered, cutting away his shirt with kitchen scissors to reveal the wound. "I won't have that on my conscience." The bullet had entered just below his right collarbone, missing his heart, but leaving a nasty wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Tess had never treated a gunshot before, but she'd assisted the doctor in Philadelphia enough times to know the basics. With shaking hands, she heated water, cleaned the wound, and packed it with strips of cloth soaked in whiskey. All through that first night she sat beside him, cooling his fever with damp cloths and praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening. Twice, she thought she'd lost him, his breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. Each time, she found herself grasping his calloused hand and speaking to him, telling him about the school she planned to build, about the books she'd brought from back east, about anything that came to mind. "You don't even know me," she said softly as dawn began to break, "but you were willing to die for me. The least I can do is keep you alive long enough to thank you properly." As if in response, the cowboy's eyes fluttered open just for a moment. They were a startling blue, like the sky after a storm. "Water," he rasped, before slipping back into unconsciousness. Tess had never felt such relief at hearing a single word. For 3 days, Matthew drifted between consciousness and delirium. When lucid, he learned that the woman who had saved him was named Tess Armstrong, a schoolteacher from Philadelphia who had come to Wyoming territory to open Bitter Creek's first proper school. In his fever dreams, she was sometimes an angel, sometimes a ghost from his past, but always a presence that anchored him to life. On the 4th day, he woke with a clearer mind to find her asleep in a chair beside the bed, her head resting on her arms at the edge of the mattress. The early morning light filtering through the cabin's single window caught the gold in her brown hair, and Matthew found himself studying the curve of her cheek, the small freckles across her nose, the slight furrow between her brows. Even in sleep, she looked exhausted. Because of him. "Miss Armstrong," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Tess startled awake, blinking rapidly before her eyes focused on him. "You're awake," a smile transformed her tired face. "And you remember my name." "Hard to forget the name of the woman who dragged me out of the dirt," Matthew replied, attempting to sit up before a sharp pain reminded him of his condition. "Don't move," she cautioned, immediately at his side, helping him adjust the pillows behind his back. "The bullet went through clean, but you've lost a lot of blood. It'll be a while before you're ready to go anywhere." Matthew nodded, taking in the small cabin for the first time. It was sparse but clean, with a few feminine touches: a colorful quilt on a chair, a vase of wildflowers on the table. Books were stacked everywhere. "This is your home?" he asked. "For now," Tess confirmed, pouring him a cup of water. "I just arrived in Bitter Creek the day you were shot. I'm meant to start teaching next week, assuming I can convince the town council that a woman who harbors gunshot cowboys is fit to educate their children." There was a hint of humor in her voice, but Matthew could see the worry behind it. "I'm sorry for the trouble I've caused you." Tess shook her head firmly. "You saved my life, Mr. Daniels. Those men—" "Matthew," he interrupted. "Please." "Matthew," she repeated, and he liked the way his name sounded in her voice. "Those men would have done worse than threaten me if you hadn't stepped in." "I'm only sorry you were hurt for it. It wasn't your fault. Men like that, they're all over these territories. They see a woman alone and think she's easy prey." He studied her face. "What did you do to rile them up so quickly?" Tess's eyes dropped to her hands. "I insisted on renting the old Miller place for my school, even though Mr. Jenkins, the one who shot you, wanted it for expanding his saloon. And I may have mentioned that I believe education is more valuable to this town's future than another establishment selling whiskey." A laugh escaped Matthew before he could stop it, sending a stab of pain through his chest. "You've got spirit, Miss Armstrong, I'll give you that." "Tess," she corrected with a small smile. "If I'm calling you Matthew, it's only fair." As the days passed, Matthew's strength gradually returned. Though he remained confined to bed, he found himself looking forward to their conversations. Tess would return from her preparations for the school, painting desks, ordering supplies, negotiating with reluctant parents, and share her frustrations and small victories. In turn, Matthew told her about his life on the range, the cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, the beauty of the open prairie under a full moon. He learned that Tess had come west not just to teach, but to escape the suffocating expectations of Philadelphia society, where a widow's daughter was expected to make a suitable match rather than pursue a career. She spoke of her parents with love and a lingering grief that Matthew recognized all too well. "What about your family?" she asked one evening as they shared a simple supper of rabbit stew. She had insisted he sit at the table, his first time out of bed. Matthew poked at his food. "Lost my ma to cholera when I was 14. Pa died in the war Confederate side. After that, I headed west. Been on my own since." Tess's eyes softened with understanding. "Is that why you keep moving? No place feels like home." The question caught him off guard with its perception. "Maybe," he admitted, "never thought about it much, just always felt there was somewhere else to see, something else to do." "And what were you looking for in Bitter Creek?" Matthew met her gaze across the table. Wasn't looking for anything, just passing through. He paused. Guess it's good I was, though. Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Matthew felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared loneliness, perhaps, or the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for. The first time Matthew stood up and walked across the cabin unaided, Tess couldn't help but notice how he filled the small space not just with his physical presence, but with a quiet strength that had begun to feel essential to her days. 2 weeks had passed since the shooting, and his recovery was progressing faster than she dared hope. "You'll be leaving soon," she observed as she watched him carefully stretch his injured arm. Matthew glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Got nowhere pressing to be." "But you will go," Tess persisted, unsure why she was pushing the point. "That's what you do, isn't it? Move on." He didn't answer immediately, instead walking to the window to look out at the autumn landscape. "School starts tomorrow," he said finally. "You've got 20 kids coming by your count. You'll be busy." "That's not an answer," Tess replied, folding laundry with more force than necessary. Matthew turned to face her, leaning against the window frame. "What would you have me say, Tess?" "That I'm a drifter with no prospects, no land, nothing to offer but trouble. Those men who came after you, Jenkins and his cronies, they haven't forgotten. They're just waiting for me to recover enough to settle the score. So you're leaving to protect me, again." Tess set down the shirt she was folding, one of his that she had mended. "Don't I get a say in that decision?" "It's not about," a sharp knock at the door cut off his response. Tess opened it to find Sheriff Burke, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Miss Armstrong, there's a situation brewing. Jenkins and his boys are stirring up sentiment against your school, saying it ain't proper for you to be living alone with a man who ain't your husband, and that you ain't fit to be teaching the town's children." Tess felt her face flush with anger. "That's absurd. Mr. Daniels is recovering from a gunshot wound, a wound he received protecting me from those very men." The sheriff shifted his weight. "I understand that, madam, but you know how folks talk. The town council's calling a meeting tonight to discuss whether to proceed with the school opening." He glanced at Matthew. "Might be best if you weren't around, Daniels, for her sake." After the sheriff left, Tess turned to find Matthew already gathering his few belongings. "So that's it?" she demanded. "You're just going to leave?" "He's right," Matthew said grimly. "I'm causing you trouble just by being here. These small towns live on gossip, and your reputation, my reputation," Tess interrupted. "I don't care about gossip. I care about these children having a chance at education, and I care about—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat. Matthew paused, his saddlebag half-packed. "About what?" Tess met his gaze squarely. "About you, Matthew. These past 2 weeks having you here, it's meant something to me, more than I expected." The admission hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest. Matthew set down his bag, crossing the room to stand before her. "Tess," he said softly, reaching out to touch her cheek. "These weeks have been the closest thing to home I've felt in years, but I can't be the reason you lose everything you've worked for." Tess leaned into his touch, closing her eyes briefly. "Then help me fight for it. Come to the council meeting tonight. Show them who you really are, not some dangerous drifter, but a man who risked his life to protect a stranger because it was the right thing to do." Matthew's eyes searched hers. "And if it doesn't work, if they've already made up their minds, then we'll figure something else out," Tess said with determination. "Together." The town hall was packed that evening, with nearly every resident of Bitter Creek crammed into the small building. Whispers rippled through the crowd as Tess entered with Matthew at her side, his arm still in a sling but his stance tall and steady. Thomas Jenkins and his friends occupied prominent positions near the front, their smug expressions suggesting they believed the outcome was already decided. The town council, 5 men of varying ages, sat at a table on a raised platform, looking uncomfortable with the controversy. Mayor Wilson, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, called for order. "This meeting has been called to address concerns about the suitability of Miss Armstrong as the teacher for our new school, given recent Events. Jenkins was quick to stand. We all know what kind of woman invites a strange man into her home and keeps him there for weeks. Is that who we want teaching our impressionable children? Murmurs of agreement rose from some quarters of the room. That strange man was shot protecting me from you, Mr. Jenkins, Tess replied clearly, her voice carrying through the hall. Or have you forgotten that you pulled the trigger? Jenkins' face darkened. He interfered in a private matter. I was simply discussing business with the lady. You were threatening her, Matthew spoke up, his deep voice commanding attention. 3 armed men surrounding one woman. Where I come from, that's not how men conduct business. An older woman in the crowd nodded emphatically. My Frank saw the whole thing from the mercantile. Says this young man stepped in polite as could be, and Jenkins drew on him without warning. More voices joined in, some supporting Jenkins, others defending Tess and Matthew. The meeting dissolved into competing arguments until Mayor Wilson banged his gavel repeatedly. Enough, he shouted. Miss Armstrong, you were brought here on the recommendation of the territorial governor because we need a qualified teacher. Your credentials are not in question. He glanced at Jenkins. However, appearances matter in a small community like ours. Tess stepped forward. With all due respect, Mayor Wilson, I have done nothing improper. I provided medical care to a man who was gravely injured defending me. Would you have preferred I left him to die in the street? Of course not, but Mr. Daniels has been recovering in my home because there was no doctor available and no one else offered to help, Tess continued. If that offends the sensibilities of some in this town, perhaps they should examine why they were willing to let a good man bleed to death rather than inconvenience themselves. Matthew moved to stand beside her. I understand your concerns, he addressed the council directly. And I don't wish to cause Miss Armstrong any further trouble. That's why I've decided to stay in Bitter Creek. Tess turned to him in surprise. Not as a guest in Miss Armstrong's home, Matthew clarified, but as a permanent resident. I've spoken with Mr. Peterson about purchasing his property on the north edge of town. He's agreeable to the terms. This announcement caused another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Peterson's place was a small but decent cattle operation that had been for sale for months. You're settling here, Mayor Wilson asked skeptically. Word is you're a drifter, Daniels. I was, Matthew agreed, but I've been thinking it's time to put down roots. This seems like a good place to do it, or it could be with the right kind of leadership. His gaze flicked meaningfully to Jenkins. One of the council members, an elderly man with a white beard, leaned forward. You got the means to buy Peterson's spread. That's no small investment. I've saved most of what I've earned over the years, Matthew replied. Never had much reason to spend it until now. Tess stared at him, realizing how little she knew about this man's circumstances despite their growing closeness over the past weeks. He'd never mentioned having savings, let alone enough to purchase land. The discussion continued for another hour, but the mood had shifted. Matthew's announcement had changed the dynamic. He wasn't just a drifter passing through, but a man investing in their community. By the time Mayor Wilson called for a vote, the outcome seemed clear. The council finds no reason to delay the opening of the school, he declared. Miss Armstrong will begin teaching tomorrow as planned. He fixed Jenkins with a stern look. And there will be no further harassment of our schoolteacher or our new neighbor, or there will be consequences. As they walked back to Tess's cabin under a sky brilliant with stars, neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Tess broke the silence. Were you ever going to tell me you were planning to stay? Matthew's lips quirked in a half-smile. Wasn't planning it until this afternoon. Made the offer to Peterson just before the meeting. Why? Tess asked, stopping to look up at him. You said yourself you've never stayed in one place for long. In the moonlight, Matthew's eyes were dark and serious. Maybe I found something worth staying for. The admission hung between them, simple yet profound. I don't expect anything from you, Tess, he continued softly, but I'd like the chance to see what might happen if I stopped running, if we both did. Tess felt her heart quicken. I'm not running from anything anymore. I'm exactly where I want to be. Are you? Matthew asked, taking a step closer. Because I need to be sure. I'm not a schooled man like the ones you knew back east. I've lived rough, made mistakes. The life I'm offering won't be easy. When has anything worthwhile ever been easy? Tess replied, reaching up to touch his face. The man I knew back east would never have stepped between me and danger. He wouldn't have understood why I needed to come west to make a difference in my own way. Matthew covered her hand with his own. I think I fell in love with you that first day, watching you drag me through the dirt, determined to save a stranger who'd already given up on himself. Tess laughed softly. That's a terrible beginning to a love story. Maybe, Matthew agreed with a smile, but it's ours. When he kissed her, Tess felt as though all the pieces of her life that had seemed scattered and uncertain suddenly aligned. This was what she had been seeking without knowing it, not just purpose in her work, but a partner who understood her heart. The school opened the next day as planned. Tess welcomed 20 nervous but excited children into the freshly painted building, aware of the curious glances they cast toward the tall cowboy who had helped carry in supplies that morning. "Is that your beau, Miss Armstrong?" whispered 8-year-old Lucy Peterson, giggling behind her hand. Tess smiled. "Mr. Daniels is a friend who has been kind enough to help us get our school ready." As the weeks passed, that friendship deepened and transformed. Matthew divided his time between establishing his new ranch and helping with the school. He built bookshelves for Tess's growing library and constructed a proper playground where the children could exercise during their lunch break. In the evenings, they would often walk together through town, their relationship becoming a familiar sight to the residents of Bitter Creek. Jenkins and his friends kept their distance, especially after it became known that Matthew had hired 2 of the most respected hands in the territory to work his land, both formidable men with reputations that discouraged trouble. By Christmas, Matthew's small ranch house was complete enough for habitation, though he still spent most evenings at Tess's cabin, reluctant to part from her company. They would sit before the fire, reading together, Tess helping Matthew improve his literacy, Matthew sharing stories of the places he'd seen that she had only read about. It was during one such evening, with snow falling gently outside, that Matthew finally asked the question that had been on his mind for months. "I know it hasn't been that long," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant. "And I'm still learning how to be the kind of man who deserves someone like you. But I've never been more certain of anything than I am about loving you, Tess Armstrong." Tess set aside her book, her eyes shining. "Matthew Daniels, are you asking me something specific or just making observations?" A smile broke across his face as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, simple but elegant, with a single pearl set in gold. "I'm asking if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife, of building something permanent here together." "Yes," Tess answered without hesitation, tears of joy spilling onto her cheeks. "Nothing would make me happier." They were married in the spring of 1876, with the entire town in attendance, even Jenkins, who had gradually developed a begrudging respect for the couple after Matthew helped save his saloon from a fire during the winter. The ceremony took place in the schoolyard, beneath a canopy of fresh leaves and early blossoms. As they exchanged vows, Tess couldn't help but reflect on the strange path that had brought them together: a gunshot, an act of desperate courage, and the determination to save a stranger's life. Life in Bitter Creek was never easy. The following years brought challenges: harsh winters, drought, the ongoing struggle to convince some parents that education mattered as much for their daughters as their sons. But through it all, Matthew and Tess faced each obstacle together, their partnership growing stronger with each passing season. Their first child, a daughter named Hope, arrived a year after their wedding, followed 2 years later by a son they called James after Tess's father. The school flourished under Tess's guidance, eventually requiring a larger building and a second teacher. Matthew's ranch prospered as well, becoming known throughout the territory for its quality livestock and fair business practices. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their expanded home watching their children play in the yard, Matthew took Tess's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Saving a bleeding cowboy who brought nothing but trouble to your doorstep." Tess leaned against his shoulder, her fingers intertwined with his. "Best decision I ever made," she replied with certainty. "Though I admit, dragging you through the dirt wasn't exactly how I imagined meeting the love of my life." Matthew laughed, pulling her closer. "I'm glad you're stubborn enough to save a man against his will. And I'm glad you're brave enough to protect a stranger," Tess answered, lifting her face for his kiss. "Even if your methods could use some refinement." As the sun set over the Wyoming horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, they remained on the porch, watching their children and contemplating the unexpected journey that had brought them together. From violence had come healing, from danger safety, from a chance encounter between strangers, a love that had transformed not only their own lives but the fabric of an entire community. It wasn't the life either of them had envisioned for themselves, but as they sat together in the growing dusk, surrounded by the family they had created and the home they had built, both Matthew and Tess knew it was far better than anything they could have planned.